I find this one of those stories that intrigues me based a lot on the language gets involved, especially in modern Christianity, which I'll get to in a moment. But I don't know if you've encountered this, but it is actually one of the coolest stories in a very long time that is floating around. It's on social media everywhere. For once, there's a good thing on social media. It's even made it to national news sources, not many, but to some. And it's the World Cup visitors from around the world who have been discovering that America is not quite the country they were led to believe it was. Because they came being warned. They expected and were told to expect politics and violence and just danger. And what happened is they got here and they ran into ordinary kindness, good food, big skies, weird roadside attractions, and people who are, in fact, friendlier than the news stories, the media stories from their own countries had told them we would be. So, in other words, they arrived with a caricature of us, and then they found the place far more alive than that caricature allowed. And the reason I lead with that story, and I encourage you to look some of these up because some of them are quite funny. But I think that it has become a tendency of Christians to treat the world, to create life in this world in the same way. To treat it as this caricature of a thing that is not worth my time. In fact, it's basically a waiting room for heaven. A holding pen or a test. That's one of my favorite ones. It's a test. Or a burden, a place to survive until God finally takes us somewhere better. And because of that, we can slip into this kind of quiet contempt for ordinary life. And for bodies, and for limits, and work, even contempt for the earth itself. We don't say it bluntly. We say it in subtle ways, right? We say it at funerals and in hymns. In those little throwaway lines we like to use when suffering gets heavy. Well, this world is not my home. I'm just passing through. Sooner or later, we'll all get out of here. And then John 11 comes along and makes that whole way of talking very, very awkward. Because John doesn't look at Lazarus in the tomb the same way we look at this earth. Because I think that most of us would go, well, Lazarus got out of it, lucky him. Now he doesn't have to deal with this anymore. He's in heaven. And then Jesus calls him back. I think a lot of Christians would go, well, what did he do wrong? That he had to be brought back here. And I think that's what makes this story strange. And not just this one, because especially in John, he raises 4 people, not including himself, right? So should be strange to us because most of us have been trained to hear that the raising of Lazarus is this comforting miracle, but our language betrays us. There's this proof that Jesus has this power over death. There's this kind of teaser trailer for Easter. And all of that may be true as far as it goes, but if we stop there, we miss that sharper edge, because if death means finally escaping grief and pain and bills and bodies and family trouble and Roman occupation and all the rest of it, if that's what death means, then what exactly is Jesus doing to Lazarus? He's not calling him into some disembodied bliss or future heaven. He's calling him back into a body, back into relationship, back into town, back into hunger and fatigue and ordinary mornings, back into a life that will sooner or later end again. That is not the move of somebody who thinks that embodied life is a disposable thing. And notice that John is very deliberate in how he tells it. Mary comes to Jesus weeping. All the mourners are there. The whole thing smells and sounds like grief, and Jesus doesn't stand above it all like some kind of spiritual technician. He doesn't wave his hand and skip to the miracle. He is deeply moved. He weeps. That matters because if Jesus is about to raise Lazarus, he still takes death seriously. And in a way, part of me thinks that the weeping is that he's missed 4 days. But Jesus still takes grief seriously. Love doesn't become less loving just because resurrection is possible. So then he goes to the tomb, a cave with a stone laid against it, and when the stone is removed, he cries, "Lazarus, come out," and out comes Lazarus, right? Still bound, hands and feet wrapped, face covers, alive, yes, but not yet free. And then he says something that ought to ring in the church's ears every time they hear the story. Unbind him and let him go. Now, I want to tell you something. There is something very interesting about this phrase in the Greek. Because the phrase "let him go" could easily be translated as "forgive his going away." Because the word for "let" is like allow or permit, but it's also the word that's used in the Lord's Prayer when we say, "Forgive us our trespasses." Forgive. So this could read, "forgive his going away," as though his death were a sin in and of itself, right? Or something that needed to be forgiven. And that might press the words a little harder than John strictly intends, but it does name something. Jesus raises him, but it is the community that still has to loosen its grip on the man that they had already mourned. They have to unwrap him, yes, but they also have to stop treating him as though he belongs to the tomb. That's not a small detail. That's the church's vocation in one sentence. Christ calls people out of death. And then a people has to help them live. So I don't think this story is about escaping earth for heaven. I think it's about God's refusal to give up on life here. And that runs deeper than Lazarus. The whole Bible leans in that direction. Ezekiel does not see souls floating upward. He sees dry bones receiving flesh and breath. The God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Jesus said he came that people might have life, and that abundantly. Paul says creation itself is groaning not to be discarded, but to be set free. That's a very different imagination from the one many Christians quietly carry around, and some not so quietly. Because it means salvation is not God saying, well, creation was a fun little experiment, but let's get the good ones out of there before it's too late. It means God still loves the world enough to call life back into it. And I think that matters because Christians can get really, really good at sounding as though the holiest thing we can do is just despise the ordinary. We talk as though heaven is the real thing and earth is the disposable packaging it comes in. We talk as though bodies are embarrassing, that limits are failures, and that grief is something to hurry past. We talk as though the spiritual life means getting less entangled with the dusty and the messy and the hungry and the needy realities of being human. But Jesus keeps doing the exact opposite. He feeds people, he touches body, he attends to wounds, he weeps at graves, he raises the dead back into households and towns and tables. That does not sound like contempt for earthly life to me. That sounds like the fierce love of a God who refuses to surrender this world too quickly. Maybe that's the part of the story that bothers us. Because a lot of versions of Christianity are built on the promise of escape. Endure long enough. Believe hard enough. Die eventually. And then the real life begins somewhere else. You know, if you click on the correct accept terms and conditions box. But John 11 says at the very least that Jesus is not in such a hurry to abandon the world. And he does it again, by the way. 5 chapters later, when he's sitting with his disciples, he talks about a woman being in labor and she is in pain during childbirth. But when the child is born, he says, she forgets her pain because a new life has been brought into this world. So if Jesus is not in a hurry to abandon the world, then maybe we should be a little less eager. Talking as though the point of life is simply to endure this place until we can leave it. Now, I want to be very clear that I am not saying that hope beyond death is false. I'm just saying that John 11 will not let us use that as an excuse to belittle life now. In fact, that is one of the things I hear more people crying for from Christianity than anything. That are simple little phrases like someday it will get better, or this world is a test, or something like that. Pray about it. Their response is, look, I am so happy that there's a heaven. There's going to be someplace great to go to, but I am suffering now. I need help now. Because Lazarus isn't called back into fantasy. He's called back into limitation. And that's important. He comes out still wrapped, still needing help, still mortal, still human, still headed one day towards another death. So in other words, Jesus doesn't call him back into triumphalism. He calls him back into dependence. Which may be why this story is so important for churches, because resurrection is not only about what happens after death. It's about whether the church knows what to do with people who have come staggering out of their own tombs, figuratively. Still bound in half of their old wrappings. Can we help unwrap one another? Can we make room for people still learning how to breathe again? Can we honor embodied, imperfect, unfinished life? Or are we only impressed by polished spiritual success? Because Lazarus certainly does not walk out of that cave like a superhero. He comes out needing a community. And Jesus seems perfectly content with that. The hard word, I think, here is that the raising of Lazarus exposes how quickly Christians can become more interested in life elsewhere than in the lives right in front of us. And we can talk about heaven while neglecting the wounded body. We can romanticize eternity while ignoring the lonely neighbor. We can speak glowingly about the next life while quietly treating this one as expendable. And that's not just a theological mistake, it's a moral one. Because if life here is only a waiting room, then why bother too much with the poor? Why bother too much with the sick? Why bother too much with the wounded or the addicted or the grieving or the exhausted or the ones whose lives are all bandages and tomb cloth at the moment? Wouldn't it be better if we just let them die? Oh, now I'm thinking of Scrooge and decrease the surplus population. But if this world is still beloved by God, if bodies still matter, if ordinary life is still worth being called back into, then mercy is unavoidable. Feeding and healing and visiting and comforting and repairing and refusing despair are not supposed to be the side hobbies of the church. They are part of what it means to believe in a Christ who calls people back to life. And I know that some of you are thinking, we're really good at that here. And I'm going to, again, here's a hard truth. You might not be as good at it as you think you are. And maybe that's where this sermon crosses from theology into something more personal, right? A lot of people are tired. We know, right? We're tired. A lot of people are tired. Not dramatically, not movie scene, go on without me tired. Just ordinary, bone level, modern tired. And when people get that tired, heaven starts sounding like communion, less like communion with God and more like simply being done. Done with pain, done with stress, done with effort, done with the heaviness of being alive. And I understand that. I really do. But the story of Lazarus will not let me preach a gospel of relief. And quite frankly, neither will my God. Because Jesus stands at a grave and calls a man back, not because suffering is good, but because life is. Life with all of its limits, with all of its vulnerability, life with all of its dependence and unfinishedness, if that's even a word. Life that still needs to be unbound. That's the life Jesus calls holy enough to summon from a tomb. And let's not miss the irony. The one calling Lazarus out would soon step out of one himself. Maybe that should change how we speak, because maybe Christians should be more careful when talking as though dying were always the best thing that could happen to someone. Because I promise you, the younger generations are listening and they've heard that. So maybe we should stop speaking as though the earth were merely the place we're trying to get out of. Maybe we should let Romans 8 remind us that creation groans not because it is meaningless, but because it is waiting for redemption. Redemption, by the way, that does not come from God, but comes from the children of God finally stepping forward. The world is not trash. The world is wounded. And there is a difference. Bodies aren't embarrassments, they're fragile gifts, and there is a difference. And old age and sickness and grief and mortality do not make a life disposable. If anything, they reveal how much tenderness and mercy such a life requires. So what do we do now with Lazarus? Maybe we let him challenge the cheap heaven talk that has made some Christians so derisive of life on earth that they'll say the devil controls it and not God. We let him remind us that Jesus does not treat embodied life as a throwaway stage set. We let him expose our quiet contempt for ordinary existence. And we hear Jesus say to the church, unbind him, let him go. Which means if Christ calls people back to life, we had better become the kind of people who know how to help them live. Not just preach at them, not just sort them, not just reassure ourselves about where they will go when they die. Help them live, help them breathe, help them eat, help them heal, help them belong. That, it seems to me at least, is a much more difficult faith than simply waiting to escape, which is probably why very few people do it. But even though it may be more difficult, it's a much more beautiful one. Jesus doesn't stand at Lazarus' grave and celebrate his escape. Jesus weeps and calls life back. He calls a man back into a body, a community, love, need, and unfinished human life, not because death is harmless, not because grief is unreal, but because the world, for all of its sorrow, is still loved. And if that's true, then faithfulness cannot mean despising life until heaven rescues us from it. It just means joining Christ and calling life forth and helping unwrap one another when that life comes stumbling out of the tomb. Amen.